7th of July 2017, 122 countries voted in favour of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Countries that don't have nuclear weapons but live under their threat voted for a ban. Without the knowledge of most of their citizens, the governments of the world's nuclear powers didn't vote, and yet the ban went ahead. Something new is happening.
To challenge the mainstream security discourse that treat these as tools of international security, the language of deterrence, treating these weapons as something that prevents conflict, instead of actually examining them for what they are.
The focus changed from tools of security and stability to human beings are destroyed.
After all, it's the people who suffer, and this has been forgotten in our debate.
Now, we today have a massive body of evidence that a nuclear war would simply not only not be winnable, it would likely destroy life on Earth as we know it today.
The international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons was launched by people who consider that nuclear weapons produce unspeakable suffering in human beings and create an unacceptable humanitarian catastrophe.
So we established this campaign around 2006, and we felt that the specific objective needed to be a treaty that outlawed nuclear weapons completely.
So we're about 11 years old now, and was very much inspired by the campaign to ban landmines and the Cluster Munitions Coalition.
At 2:45 in the morning, August runway into the air.
On August the 6th, 1945, a uranium bomb was dropped on Hiroshima.
At that moment, I saw in the window the tremendous flash. And I couldn't comprehend, but before you had a chance to comprehend what was happening, I knew my body was flying up in the air. After that, I lost consciousness. Now, when I regained the consciousness in the total darkness and silence, I knew, finally, Americans got us. Also, it happened at 8:15 in the morning. It was dark, dark like twilight. And then I began to see in the dark some moving objects, but they were so silent. They didn't look like human beings. The hair was standing up and all curled up, and skin and flesh were just falling out. Some were carrying the eyeballs in their hands, the skin and the flesh hanging. The majority of my schoolmates were working in the center part of the city. They are the first one who simply vaporized, melted. From my school, over 300 students were there. I'm alive because I wasn't there. I was somewhere else. For 1 mile away, I was inside the building. I was buried by the collapsed building. I must have been protected. But those people had no protection directly under.
From that point on, any power that did not have nuclear weapons would feel vulnerable. In subsequent years, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, France and China developed their own atomic bombs in a context of confrontation between Western and Eastern blocs during a period known as the Cold War. This is also the time when the United Nations was founded in an attempt to create a forum for mediation in order to prevent conflicts from escalating into armed confrontation.
The United Nations had been working to address the threat of nuclear weapons since its foundation.
The danger of intentional use is compounded by the risk of accident. There are currently 2,000 nuclear weapons on hair trigger alert that can be launched within minutes. In 1983, a Soviet radar system misinterpreted a cloud formation as a missile attack.
We know of at least 6 occasions when the world has come within minutes of nuclear war because deterrence failed, because one or the other nuclear weapons state, usually the United States or Russia, believed it was under attack and actually began the process of launching its own nuclear weapons, only to stop at the very last minute when the mistake was discovered.
Nuclear proliferation and technological progress are creating new dangers. There is a possibility that a small group could make a bomb. There is also the danger that a country with nuclear weapons could suffer internal ruptures or social unrest, and weapons would no longer be under safe control. Computer systems can also be hacked. Finally, any kind of explosion at a nuclear power plant would create massive, uncontrollable contamination.
Millions of people would be exposed to lethal doses of radiation. So this is an enormous problem, and one which is generally ignored completely.
Since the beginning of the nuclear age, warnings and protests from the scientific community followed one after the other and were quickly taken to the streets. In November 1961, Women for Peace were pioneers when they went on strike and publicly demonstrated and marched against nuclear weapons in 60 cities across the United States. In 1982, 1 million people gathered against nuclear weapons in New York. A year later, in Europe, there were massive protests in several cities, bringing some 3 million people onto the streets. The 1980s saw the possibility of a limited nuclear war in Europe, where both sides had enormous supplies of short-range nuclear weapons. Military exercises created a pre-war environment. Tension was at its height, and the social climate occasionally turned apocalyptic. But the turmoil caused by these alarms and social protests created the conditions for a succession of treaties and effective reductions in nuclear arsenals. Currently, the 9 nuclear weapon states have almost 15,000 bombs between them, and all of them are more powerful than the one dropped on Hiroshima. The vast majority of nuclear weapons are in the hands of the United States and the Russian Federation. 5 countries host US bombs on their territories, and 28 others are involved in nuclear alliances. But most countries do not have nuclear weapons, nor do they belong to any military alliance. But they do share the risk of confrontation, even if it occurs far from their territory. 122 countries, about 2/3 of the total, voted in favour of the ban treaty. Now the treaty has to attract 50 ratifications for it to enter into force.
The treaty includes a broad range of prohibitions, a prohibition, of course, on the use of nuclear weapons as well as the threatened use of nuclear weapons, a prohibition on testing and production of nuclear weapons, and indeed a prohibition on the possession of nuclear weapons.
They're going to have to justify why they want weapons of mass destruction, why they think threatening to mass murder civilians or end us all, collective suicide, is a reasonable security strategy.
In order for the treaty to be ratified in as many countries as possible, social pressure is paramount. The parliamentary pledge, the cities appeal, divestment campaigns, awareness raising, and mobilisation are necessary for the prohibition to take shape. And then pressure must continue until the stigmatisation of nuclear weapons ends in a real eradication.
ICANN also has what's called the Parliamentary Pledge, which is signed by over 800 parliamentarians across the world. So the ICANN Cities Appeal is a commitment that cities can make to endorse the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and call on their governments to join.
And what Don't Bank on the Bomb does is it gives everyone a pathway to resist nuclear weapons. If you have a bank account, you can do something about nuclear weapons. You can talk to your bank and ask them, do they have a policy on investment? You have a right as a consumer, you have power to do something, to change that. And people are.
Estados Unidos cerró su última fábrica de municiones en racimo sin haber nunca firmado la Convención en contra de las municiones en racimo.
You know, the U.S. never signed the landmines treaty, but we don't make them anymore and we don't use them.
The nuclear weapon ban is a clamour that is uniting people of the world to defend themselves from the military powers.
En la historia humana estamos en permanente evolución y los cambios importantes no se dan de la noche a la mañana. Si las personas que estaban luchando por el fin de la esclavitud hubieran pensado que aprobando una ley o un tratado en un lugar muy específico no se iba a lograr, no tendríamos hoy lo que tenemos.
One day, the nuclear age will be consigned to our memory like a bad dream that arose in a moment of fear and destruction. We recognise that every person's life is sacred, and we utterly reject nuclear weapons because they produce unspeakable harm and suffering in human beings.
We can be successful again as we were in the 80s, and we can save the world again. And we can look ourselves in the mirror and say, hey, okay, I did what I was supposed to do.
We Hibaksha had been waiting for the ban for 72 years. Let this be the beginning of the end of nuclear weapons.